In our last Laravel 7 lesson, you may have noticed that we have duplicated folders in our resources directory and our public directory. They both have a JS folder and a SAS folder. That doesn't make too much sense if we have those folders both places. So let's break this up and break this down. So on the left side, our resources directory, and on our right side, we have our public directory. Now, our resources directory, it never gets loaded by the URL. The URL, the browser, does not ever access resources directly. Public, on the other hand, it does. So imagine we have a browser. Well, whenever we add a URL and we reference a link, the browser can access our public files using a URL, so it can load those public assets using a URL. Where on the other side, we can only do that with public. We can't do that with the resources. So resources, you can't access that through the URL. Public, you can. Resources, you can't. Public can be loaded by the browser. Resources can't. So why do we have these two differing folders where we duplicate the JS and the SAS directory? Well, let's focus on SAS first. SAS.css is not loadable by the browser, right? It's what we call a CSS preprocessor. Now, this is huge because the browser is never going to load the SAS file, but it can load CSS files. And SAS is what's known as a CSS preprocessor. So what's that mean? Well, it means two things. One is that SAS directory should not be in our public folder. It should be in our resources folder. And we need to bundle our SAS or compile our SAS into vanilla CSS before our browser ever loads. We need to pre-process the SAS previous or prior to the actual loading of our browser. Our browser can then access the vanilla CSS. The guy in the middle responsible for pre-processing the SAS into vanilla CSS is Webpack. Laravel Mix is a Fluent API, a wrapper, a beautified wrapper around Webpack. The catch is that SAS is not the only CSS preprocessor. There's tons of them. More than that, there's actually JavaScript that needs to be preprocessed. There's multiple syntaxes of JavaScript, and not every version or syntax of JavaScript is readable by the browser. You can also combine files, and you can move files around. You can do a whole bunch of stuff with Webpack through the power of Node or backend JavaScript. You can also move stuff around using Webpack. You can combine files using Webpack. You can minify files using Webpack. You can version files using Webpack. You can cache files using Webpack. You can do a lot with Webpack. Okay, so right now we're on webpack.js.org. And this image is honestly probably the best image I can think of for showing off Webpack. So on the left side, this is actually going to be our resources directory. We can add JS, we can add .hbs, .cjs, whatever it is, .sass, .less, .stylus, which are all CSS preprocessors, or any type or format of JavaScript, which there are a lot. And we can either bundle these files together and compile them down into static assets that every single browser can read. One of the things with Webpack is it gets a little confusing. It's a really, really cool technology, but it has all of this stuff. It's its own beast of a thing to learn, right? So Laravel, and specifically Jeffrey Ways, being as awesome as Laravel and Jeffrey both are, they created this thing called Laravel Mix, which has its own website. Now, Laravel Mix is a fluent wrapper around Webpack. And so instead of having to deal with all of this jazz right over here, output, input, module.exports, can we require, dependency graphs, all of this stuff, you can basically ignore for most of the use cases. And within Laravel, you can use this Laravel.mix. And this is just a Webpack around, or a wrapper around Webpack, and it's called Laravel Mix. To interact with Laravel Mix, you just go to our app and then webpack.mix.js. And so, with that in mind, how do we use it? Well, first, let's go and open up both our directories. And let's see, we got our SAS right here. We just said we can't even load this in our browser, so it shouldn't be in our public directory. So let's just add all of this stuff, and let's just move it right here. Just like that, and we'll refactor. Okay, now we're going to delete our file just like that. And what we're going to do instead is we're going to see, okay, we're going and we're outputting to our main.css. So we're going to go down to webpack.mix. Now what we're going to do is we're simply going to add another .sass. We're going to say resources/sass/main.css or SCSS. And we want to point that and output it to our public assets/CSS directory. Now, more than that, we've already got our main.css there, so let's actually, for now, just output it to our CSS. So what that should do is it's going to say public, and then it's going to go and create a new CSS directory, and then create a main.css file in that directory. That leaves us a question, though. How do we actually run our Webpack file? You're going to have to go to nodejs.org and then download Node. Pick whatever operating system you are on and install, I would say the current. You don't need to get the latest, but just the current version for the operating system you're on. This will install Node, which is backend JavaScript. We're not really going to be using it too much, at least not knowingly. But we do need it to properly use Webpack through Laravel Mix. When you install Node, it's going to install npm as well. Now, npm is very similar to Composer. Composer is a package manager that installs PHP packages. npm is a package manager that installs JavaScript packages. Composer needs PHP, the CLI version, to run properly. npm needs Node, which is server-side JS, aka the command line version of JavaScript when on a server, to run properly. They both need a server-side language to properly run and install/update packages and the dependencies that a given application has on whatever packages. They also both have a project level dependencies file. So composer.json, that's Composer, package.json, that's npm. Now, these will define the dependencies that npm has installed or Composer has installed. And when they install these packages, these dependencies, whether it's npm's JavaScript packages or Composer's PHP packages, Composer will install all of the PHP packages in vendor, where npm will install all of the JavaScript packages in node modules. They also both have a lock file. So a lock file on composer side, composer.lock, on npm side, package lock.json, those are used to lock in the versions of a given package so you can work better in a team. And then, of course, they both also have the terminal tool, which is composer or npm. Composer install, npm install. Composer require, npm install. We can go to our terminal and we can run npm install. Now, what is npm install going to do? Well, just like we have composer.json, where we have all of our PHP packages from our composer.json, we have our package.json. And this is all of our JavaScript packages. And so we can do npm install, and we'll just install all of the packages defined in our package.json, equivalent to composer.json and composer install, just for JavaScript. Now that we have our npm install command executed, we can go back and see this new node modules directory. Whenever we ran composer install, composer creates this vendor directory with all of our PHP packages. Just like composer creates vendor, npm creates this node modules directory with all of our JavaScript packages. So we know it ran properly. Now, you can also see that we have scripts defined in our package.json. And these packages, or these scripts, have npm run dev and npm run development. And you can pretty much ignore this, except I want you to notice that this script calls the Webpack.js. It calls Webpack from our node modules. And so that is npm run development. An alias of npm run development is npm run dev. Knowing this, we can now do npm run dev. Now, before we run this, notice we don't have a CSS directory in here. In webpack.mix, we said, okay, get our Sass main.css from resources and output that to a public CSS directory. So now, when we go back and we run npm run dev, because we defined Webpack, we told Webpack to compile to a public/CSS directory, it'll do that. And there we go. And there's some errors there, but we now have our public CSS directory. It looks like our errors prevented us from actually loading the thing. So the first thing is our fonts. So if we go to assets and we grab our CSS, let's do this. Copy that. Go back here. We'll just paste that right there. All right. For our images as well. So what we're going to actually do, we're going to copy this. So our Sass is looking for our images. So what we can do is we'll paste our images right there. Next, let's copy our entire fonts directory. We're going to do the same thing. And this is just because our Sass is relatively referencing our fonts and our images within the .scss files. So now, if we go back to npm we do npm run dev, we'll probably still get some warnings, but nope, good to go. And it successfully compiled. So now if we go back and we go to public CSS and then main.css, we have properly used Webpack to bundle our fancy SCSS or SAS via Laravel Mix. Next time, we'll dive in and we'll do a little bit more on Webpack, and then we'll move on.
Simpler, simpler.